All right. Today we are going to be in Ruth. Probably a familiar story for many. Familiar historical account, just a short 4 chapters. Chronicles the story of Ruth and Naomi. We're introduced to Boaz and the concept of a kinsman redeemer or a guardian redeemer, depending on your translation. Ruth is set during the time of the Judges, and so it is a time of social and political instability, turmoil. If you think about the time of the Judges, it's constantly in and out of war. Last verse of the book of Judges gives us a very good summary, kind of sets the stage for what things were like at the time of Ruth. It's a verse that is repeated many times throughout the Judges. Anybody got an idea of what that verse is?
They had turned away from the Lord.
Huh?
Something like they had turned away from the Lord.
Very close. Yep. 21:25. In those days, Israel had no king. Everyone did as they saw fit. How does that work today if all of us are left to our own devices and everybody does what they think is right in their own eyes? Chaos and turmoil ensues, and that is the atmosphere at the time of the Judges, and that's where we are with Ruth, the time in which this takes place. Author is unknown, but many suspect that it was either King Solomon or maybe even Samuel that wrote the book of Ruth. If you think about Ruth, what you know of the book, how would you summarize it? What themes come to mind if you were to put a theme on the book of Ruth?
Loyalty.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Any other words come to mind?
Relying on God. I mean, they had nothing and just kept going.
Mm-hmm. God's provision.
God's sovereignty over events.
Sovereignty. You hear the word redeemer used a lot with the book of Ruth. So as Mary Faith said, I mean, one of the themes is God reverses Naomi and Ruth's hopeless situation, providing them and ultimately Israel with hope. And while that's true, as has been said, there's so much more in this book. Again, we hear that word redemption used so many times with the book of Ruth. What does that word mean, redemption? It's a good churchy word, if you will, but can leave many wondering at what its meaning is if you didn't grow up in church.
Bought with a price.
Bought with a price, yeah. Word redemption is actually not a religious word. It's a word out of the culture. It's a word out of actually what we would call family law today. Webster's defines it as to gain or regain possession of something in exchange for payment. So Chris put it even more succinctly, spot on. We know in this story who plays the character of the Redeemer. Boaz. And excuse my language when I say plays the character. This is a actual historical account. So while I'll call it a story, this is a historical account. So let me be clear there. In the same way, though, as Boaz is going to give us this archetype and this foreshadowing of Christ, our redeeming figure, Christ has redeemed us, paid the price, as Chris said, and that's the imagery that we're going to see all throughout this. And so we're very much going to see a picture of God's faithfulness, His undeserved grace and love, hesed love that we'll see pictured in Boaz. But there's what's that? Chesed, yes. While Ruth and Boaz take center stage in this story, though, the book of Ruth is really about Naomi's journey from emptiness to fullness, to use her words to pick out of the book here. But we're gonna use a track from tears to triumph. We're gonna use this as we step through the book of Ruth, and we are gonna step through chapter by chapter. So please turn to Ruth if you haven't already. We know this is Baptist approved because each of the 4 points start with the same letter. These are summaries that you can use to read the book to bring a context to the book of Ruth. But chapter 1 can be summarized by tears. Chapter 2 is Toil. Chapter 3 is Trust. And Chapter 4, finally, Triumph. And so we're going to use this to step through the book. So as we start out, Chapter 1, verses 1 through 5, somebody doesn't mind to read that either out of your Bible or on screen. If you read from screen, it'll be 2 slides, and I'll move it for you.
In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. So a man from Bethlehem in Judah, together with his wife and 2 sons, went to live for a while in the country of Moab. The man's name was Elimelech, and his wife's name was Naomi. And the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem, Judah. And they went to Moab and lived there. Now Elimelech, Naomi's husband, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. They married Moabite women, one named Orpah and the other Ruth. They lived there about 10 years. After they had lived there about 10 years, both Mahlon and Chilion also died, and Naomi was left without her 2 sons and her husband.
We see many things open up in these first 5 verses. As you read these verses, what are things that stand out? How is the stage set? So first of all, we see that it takes place in the time of the judges. It tells us right off the bat. And so we can bring in what we know of the political and social turmoil of the time of the judges. This is the stage where this is taking place. And then what are the circumstances? Famine, so bad that it forced them out of their home. And not just out of their home, but to leave Bethlehem and go to Moab. So they're not just going, that is we may not understand it as much today, but for an Israelite to leave the land of Israel and go to the foreign land of Moab, a big deal. So this is a famine bad enough to drive them out of their entire home nation. We know from the book of Judges as well that Israel was in and out of war with Moab constantly, if you read the book of Judges. So speculating, but probably unlikely that they're welcomed with open arms in the land of Moab as well. This was out of survival. This was out of necessity for them to go there. We see that Elimelech, Naomi's husband, dies. And it's kind of, I don't know, I kind of find it humorous is the wrong word, but it says right after that, Naomi's husband died, but it's almost like it's okay, she was left with her 2 sons. And then the very next sentence, they're taken as well. But it says they married Moabite women. If you're a good Jewish Israelite family, is that your dream for your sons to marry foreign women? No. So again, this is just compounding it as you read further and further into these first 5 verses. Don't miss the stage that is being set here, if you will. And we're intended to see these things. Anybody remember where the Moabites originated from? Genesis 19. So both of Lot's daughters became pregnant by their father. The older daughter had a son, and she named him Moab. He is the father of the Moabites today. The younger daughter also had a son, and she named him Ben-Ammi. He is the father of the Ammonites today. So this is not just any foreign nation, any foreign woman. This is a nation that was born out of incest. You mentioned the Samaritans. The reason that the religious Jews despise the Samaritans is because they intermarried with non-Israelite tribes. Same thing is now happening with Naomi's sons, not just with any tribe, but a tribe born out of incest. And I don't want to make too much of that, but it is there. But we're going to see that even that part of the account is redeemed by the end of the book. We also see it indicates that Orpah and Ruth more than likely were barren. It says they were in the land for 10 years and no mention of sons. Or we know they didn't have sons. And so more than likely the wombs of both of these women were closed for whatever reason. And then we see both husbands of Orpah and Ruth die. So Naomi is left without a husband, without her sons, without any male protector or provider in the family. And so when you think about this, Mary Faith started to talk about this. How would you describe this scenario of Naomi? Yeah, hopeless, utter chaos, if you will. If you remember going back to our lessons on Genesis, and we've mentioned this previously, but I mean, this is the antithesis of shalom. Nothing is as it should be. Everything is wrong. This is chaos. Nothing is right in her life, and it has to leave her with a sense of hopelessness.
Both things that she lost, her land and her lineage, those were the source of blessings for the Israelites. And that's what they viewed as coming from God's hand.
Absolutely.
Place and family, and both of those were lost.
Specifically about her being left with no husband and no male. Why is this significant? Well, as Mary Faye said earlier, women had significant roles within the household, but that typically did not extend beyond the household, commercially or economically. They didn't have independent careers, as we would call it. They relied upon their husbands for sustenance, the male heads of household. And this is a very important concept for us to grasp as we look at this book of Ruth. This was a patriarchal culture. You know, we hear that many times throughout Scripture, right? And there's a picture here that we want to use as we walk through the book of Ruth, but extends far beyond the book as well. Patriarchal culture has a bad name today, and it's certainly a culture that is ripe for abuses. We see male dominance, we see women treated as property, but that's not its intent, and certainly not God's design. Regardless of our impression of a patriarchal system, it is what they lived. And we know that God used systems that they lived and were familiar with to teach them things about himself. Think about our conversations as Israel was drawn out of Egypt. God used the sacrificial system that they knew and were very familiar with to show them how to use it for his glory. He's going to do the same thing with the patriarchal system that they knew and lived. In this system, centered around what was called the Beit Ab, father's house. Beit is house, Ab is father. Remember Jesus calling out Abba, daddy version of father. Beit Lechem, Bethlehem, house of bread. So father's house, Beit Ab. It extended, the entire extended family lived together. So the oldest male is the patriarch. You had his wives and concubines, their children. So you had females who were not yet married. When they married, they moved into the Beit Ab of their husband. You had male children, whether they were married or not. If they were married, they brought their wives in, their children, and this extended into, you could call a compound. But the oldest male was the patriarch, and he was in charge, period. He was king in the household. He owned every possession. Everything was under his control. He decided how it was used. If he passed, if he died, the next oldest male would take the place, be the patriarch, and lead the household. Now, we may look at that and again think that it's ripe for abuse, but we also have to keep in mind that the patriarch not only was king, but every responsibility was his. Every member of that household was his responsibility. So if you're hungry, go to the patriarch. You're tent linking, go to the patriarch. Are you sick, you need medicine? Go to the patriarch. Robe ripped? Go to the patriarch. Do you remember Moses being worn down in the desert because the entire nation was coming to him and he was sitting from sunup to sundown hearing the cases and the problems, and it wore him down? That is the scenario here. That is the patriarch. Moses was seen as the patriarch of the nation. The patriarch in the household, it is his responsibility to solve the problems, if you will, of every member who comes to him. So he was, every issue, every conflict, every concern, it was his responsibility to fix it. The system worked because it was shameful not to take care of the family. A concept that we as Westerners don't really understand. It's easy for us to brush off shame. We are not a shame culture. But a shame culture is still very much alive in many parts of the world today. And shame is one of the worst things that you can have come into your family. So the system worked because it was shameful not to take care of the family. If you wanted to show off, you didn't have the biggest tent or house, you didn't drive the biggest car or donkey. You had the most well cared for Beit Ab. Everyone was cared for. But what happens if someone became marginalized from the Beit Ab? Their connection to the Beit Ab was cut off. They lose access to clothing, food, protection, fertility as a female. They became, when you were cut off from the Beit Ab, you became the widow, the orphan, the lost, the stranger, the alien among us. So we'll come back to this concept, but this is the cultural concept upon which the redemption laws are going to sit upon. And this is where Naomi finds herself, marginalized, cut off from Beit Ab, stripped from provision, stripped from protection, no sons to take over as patriarch. She must live as a widow and as a foreigner in the land of Moab. And so it's implied here that she's beyond childbearing age. Verse 13, or verse 12, I'm sorry, says, I'm too old to have another husband. In this scenario, widows were many times reduced to selling themselves into slavery or prostitution for survival or begging. Did God care how the widows were treated? Very much so. Specifically, absolutely. We see all throughout Torah, Exodus, Deuteronomy specifically, verses like, you shall not take advantage of any widow. Don't pick your vineyards bare. Leave them to provide for the widows, the fatherless, and the stranger. Cursed is the one who does not give justice to the stranger, the fatherless, and the widow. Isaiah 1:17 says, plead on behalf of widows. So again and again and again, we could point to verses that there were laws on how the widows were to be cared for. But again, go back to where we are in this point in time. There was no king. Everybody did as they saw fit. So do you think the Levirate laws were followed day in and day out? More than likely not. This is in part, again, the reason for the existence of the guardian and the redeemer laws is to prevent the harsh treatment or the harsh circumstances that the law was meant to protect. And so this is where Naomi finds herself, in this state of chaos. We would say Orpah and Ruth do as well, but what's the difference between Orpah and Ruth and Naomi? What does Naomi tell them to do? Go home. Go back to the Beit Ab. Go back to your father's household. You're young. You can remarry. You can be provided for. You can still have a life. She doesn't have that option. Verse 13 says it, this is Naomi speaking, it is more bitter for me than for you because the Lord's hand has turned against me. She believes God is against her. Hence the term we see in this first chapter as we summarize it with the word tears. The scenario in which she finds herself and the fact that she sees God has turned against her. And it's through these tears that Naomi begins to assess her situation and begin to plan. So if we come back to the end of these first 5 verses, even in the midst of these tears, we do begin to see foreshadowing. Verse 6 says, when Naomi heard in Moab that the Lord had come to the aid of his people by providing food for them, she and her daughters-in-law prepared to return home from there. And again, we get this just slight vision of foreshadowing that the Lord has come to the aid of his people. She's going to urge her daughters-in-law to return to their homes. As we know, Orpah returns, but we see, as Chris said, the famous oath of loyalty from Ruth that we see in verse 16. Ruth replied, don't urge me to leave you or turn back from you. Where you go, I will go. Where you stay, I will stay. Your people will be my people, and your God will be my God. What choice is Ruth making in light of everything we just said?
To remain in her family.
Mm-hmm.
To leave her father.
Mm-hmm.
And her culture as well.
Mm-hmm.
They came from a different place, not a true Jewish culture
Yep.
that Naomi would have come from.
Is she doing what's in her best self-interest? No.
Because she's joining up with Naomi, who is now a stranger, a foreigner. She's becoming a foreigner herself.
Yep.
In a foreign land.
And she knows what she's choosing. She knows Naomi has been cut off from any provision or protection as well. She is choosing a life of, how we'll summarize chapter 2, a life of toil. To her, the only existence can be a life of begging for survival. In the face of uncertainty about her future, though, we see here that she in some sense, finds certainty in the God of Naomi. And so she chooses to give up living life on her terms. And she chooses to stay with Naomi. Jeremiah 45, verse 5 says, "Are you seeking great things for yourself? Don't do it. I will bring great disaster upon all these people, but I will give you your life as a reward wherever you go." These words had not yet been written in the time of Ruth, but she's living them nonetheless. She gave up her self-interest, and as we already know, it's going to be returned to her many times over. And we see that promise then explicitly here in the book of Jeremiah. Verse 19, so the two women went on until they came to Bethlehem. When they arrived in Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them, and the women exclaimed, "Can this be Naomi?" Why is it that the town was stirred? Maybe they were upset. You left us, you abandoned us, you went to a foreign land. You're coming back. Maybe it was because she looked like a shadow of who she was when she left. She would have been in grieving. She would have returned without Elimelech and sons, who theoretically her neighbors would have known. We can speculate on many different reasons. We're given a sense that it's due to her grief, but I imagine there could be many things at play there. But the city is stirred at her return. She says to them, "Don't call me Naomi. Call me Mara, because the Almighty has made my life very bitter. I went away full, but the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi? The Lord has afflicted me. The Almighty has brought misfortune upon me." There's further imagery here in that the word Naomi derives from the Hebrew word which means pleasant or sweet or delightful. So she's making a play on her own name. Further highlighting the chaos of her circumstances, that she desires to be called bitter. But this is how we see Naomi as we end chapter 1. It's ironic here that she says she left full but returns empty. Keep in mind, she left the land of famine that was empty, is coming back when God is providing, yet calls herself empty. Earlier she said the Lord had turned against her. Now she's saying the Lord has made her life bitter, afflicted her, brought misfortune upon her. All these details, again, we're meant to pick up on. This is a picture of the opposite of shalom. Nothing is where it is supposed to be. And again, we're going to see foreshadowing as chapter 1 comes to a close. Verse 22 says, "So Naomi returned from Moab, accompanied by Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, arriving in Bethlehem just as barley harvest was beginning." There's about to be bounty. Just as we say there was a cross before a crown, there's going to be toil before triumph here. And so as we enter chapter 2, we're introduced to Boaz, but the characters of our story are not. We, the reader, are. Verse 1 says, "Now Naomi had a relative on her husband's side, a man of standing from the clan of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz." And we're given this detail by way of background. Again, Naomi and Ruth, there's no interaction yet. And so the writer of Ruth is wanting to set this stage so that we begin to see the orchestration of God's hand as we continue to read. There's no other reason to give this detail at this point in time. We're told he's a man of standing. What do we think that means?
Wealthy.
Yeah, he's a man of means. It's the same word used to describe Saul before he was anointed king by Samuel. He was a man of standing. Could mean a man of valor, strong, established. It could mean military leader. Doesn't have to. But what we can say is that he was a man of means. And so Ruth is going to go to Naomi and begin to take on the role that she pledged an oath of loyalty to do what she can to help provide for the two of them. So it says she goes to Naomi and says, "Let me go to the fields and pick up the leftover grain behind anyone in whose eyes I find favor." Naomi told her to go. Did it require that Ruth find favor in somebody's eyes for her to be able to glean from the fields?
Not supposed to.
Was there a law that said? Yeah, I mean, Leviticus
Don't clean your corners, or don't plow your corners.
Leviticus 23 instructed you not to glean to the edges, not to glean the corners of your field. Leave them for the fatherless, the widow, and the needy among you. But again, we're in the time of the judges. There is no king. Doubtful that everyone was following the law. And so Ruth knows this. We see from interaction here, we see it's further confirmed by Boaz momentarily, and then again by Naomi in conversation. We see this sense of danger that Ruth is taking on to go into the fields during this time. Again, confirming the social and economic turmoil during this time in history. Ruth is putting herself in danger to go into the fields, even though the law required it. So she would carefully approach the task, hoping to find someone in whose eyes she found favor that would let her glean. And so Ruth goes out in the fields. Where does she end up? Boaz's fields. Boaz arrives, greets the workers, notices Ruth, and says, "Who is this?" And he's told who she is, the daughter-in-law of Naomi. And so he goes to Ruth and tells her not to glean in anyone else's field, that his workers will watch out for her, that they'll protect her. Again, he's confirming this sense of danger. He gives her bread and wine till she's full, provides a meal, and then provides even further grain than she gathered for the day to send her home to Naomi. And then tells his servants, don't just leave scraps, pick stalks and intentionally leave them behind. And so we're getting ahead of ourselves a little bit, but Boaz, again, is going to be the redeemer and foreshadowing of Christ. But in these details, if we can draw parallels, we can't go further into these with the time we have, but look at these details of how Boaz treats Ruth and the parallels that can be drawn here. In her eyes, she's going to be drinking from an endless supply of water from Boaz's servants, living water. She eats at his table bread and wine, receiving the bread of life. He tells her, don't go into other fields. You cannot serve two masters. Everything you need is here. Not just sustenance, but he sends her home with abundance. And again, these are pictures that we see as we draw the parallels between the Redeemer figure here and who we know is the ultimate confirmation of that role. But Ruth's prayers are answered. Verse 10 says, she bowed down with her face to the ground. She asked him, why have I found such favor in your eyes that you notice me, a foreigner? Again, repeating her words that were before a prayer, now in thankfulness that she has found what she sought after. But she doesn't yet fully understand or appreciate what she has found because it's not been revealed to her yet. Verse 3 says, as it turned out, she wound up in Boaz's fields, almost like a chance encounter. Was this a chance encounter? No, we've already been given the context in verse 1 of who Boaz was, so that now we can begin to see the orchestration of God's hand. We know Proverbs 16 says, in their hearts, humans plan their course, but the Lord establishes their steps. We make our plans, but God directs our steps. And that's exactly what's happening here. And what we're meant to see is the hand of God orchestrating throughout the generations, even when there is no king. There is a king. And so we see from beginning to go from misfortune to favor. As Ruth returns home, tells Naomi the day's events, Naomi connects the dots, doesn't she? Verse 20 says, "The Lord bless him." Naomi said to her daughter-in-law, he, meaning Boaz, has not stopped showing his kindness to the living and the dead. She added, "That man is our close relative. He is one of our guardian redeemers." So through tears and toil, if you will, we're beginning to see trust start to form, that there just might be a plan. There just might be a path for Naomi and Ruth. And so chapter 2 closes with Ruth staying close to the workers in Boaz's field, being protected, receiving sustenance as she gathers. And chapter 3 is going to open at the end of harvest now with the winnowing and the threshing floor, at the threshing floor. Do you remember what Naomi tells Ruth to do? To go down to the threshing floor?
Go out with him.
Yeah.
Cover his feet.
Kind of an odd instruction. But verse 3 and 4 says, "Wash, put on perfume, and get dressed in your best clothes." You're going to prom. Then go down to the threshing floor, but don't let him know that you're there until he has finished eating and drinking. When he lies down, note the place where he is lying. Then go and uncover his feet and lie down. He will tell you what to do. And so we know what happens. She follows her instruction, goes down, and he awakens to find Ruth at his feet. Says, "Who are you?" She says, I'm Ruth. And verse 9, Ruth says to him, "Spread the corner of your garment over me, since you are a guardian redeemer of our family." We don't really know the cultural significance of what Naomi instructs her to do. It's not repeated anywhere else in Scripture. We don't see it in other extra-biblical historical accounts. But it's clear that Boaz makes a connection of for whatever she is doing, and then she makes her request explicit here. But what is she asking when she says, "Spread the corner of your garment over me"?
Take me under your wing.
Take me under your wing, absolutely. So if we go back to verse 12, chapter 2, Boaz says this to Ruth, "May the Lord repay you for what you have done. May you be richly rewarded by the Lord, the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." And so she's now saying, "Take me under your wing." So yes, this is an idiom for marriage, but it's more than that. It's invoking the guardian redeemer laws that we'll see. Ezekiel 16, obviously not written at this time, but we see this used later. It says, "Later I passed by you." This is God speaking of Israel. "Later I passed by you, and when I looked at you and saw that you were old enough for love, I spread the corner of my garment over you and covered your naked body. I gave you my solemn oath and entered into a covenant with you, declares the sovereign Lord, and you became mine." And this is what we see here happening between Ruth and Boaz. Not just marriage, but again, this guardian redeemer relationship. We spoke earlier of the Beit Ab, the Father's house, and everything that it entailed. And we're now introduced to this word redeemer, kinsman redeemer, depending on your translation. Again, we said it's not a religious concept, it's a cultural concept. And this word redeem, Gaal, it had to do with family law. We said earlier what happens when somebody becomes marginalized. They're cut off from provision, from protection, from fertility, from clothing, food. Gaal, to redeem, is whatever action the Beit Ab takes to bring that marginalized person back in. To welcome them back into the resources of the family. The resources of the Beit Ab are used to repay the debt, whatever the debt may be, and to redeem the lost. And so, again, don't miss the imagery here. The lost and the foreigner is cut off from the Father's house with no way to reconcile on their own accord. But the Father pays the price to bring them back in. The Father redeems and makes a way, not only makes a way for reconciliation, but for full restoration. provision, protection,
Like adoption.
bounty. We are adopted as sons. Absolutely. Don't miss that imagery here. So Ruth makes this request to Boaz, but what was Boaz's response? I will do everything you've said, but there is another. He recognizes this gesture for what it is and continues to be taken back by her kindness, saying you could have approached younger men, but you've chosen to further remain loyal to your oath to Naomi. And so he says, I will do everything that you've asked, but he asks her to trust him that he's going to address it because there is one closer. And so as we go into chapter 3, this chapter is characterized by trust. Naomi's plan requires trust that God would continue to orchestrate. Ruth requires courage and trust to follow Naomi's plan. Boaz trusts Ruth's character and intentions as he recognizes the request and says so explicitly. And so we see that he's committed to resolving the situation. Verse 18, Ruth comes back to Naomi, tells her what happened, and Naomi says this, wait, my daughter, until you find out what happens, for the man will not rest until the matter is settled today. And so, as we so often find as well, trust often involves waiting. And that's the instruction that Ruth is given. But again, we see this foreshadowing that Boaz is not going to rest until the situation is settled. There's going to be resolution. There's going to be triumph. And so Boaz goes to the city gates, finds his relative, and tells him the situation. You remember the man's response? First, he agrees, right? There's someone needs to take this valuable piece of land. Raises his hand, absolutely, I'll take it. Oh, by the way, yeah. Oh, by the way, it comes with Naomi and Ruth. And then his response is, then I cannot redeem it because I might endanger my own estate. You redeem it yourself. I cannot. He was interested when it was just land because that would increase the value of his estate. But now he finds out that it comes with these women that he's not willing to expend the resources of his Beit Ab to support.
So with inheritance laws, is there, I know like it talks about later on, like the first son of Ruth, does he inherit that price? Is that how that works? So technically he's providing for 20 years until this kid then owns the property.
Well, that's the rub. If he just took the property, it becomes his inheritance and passes down to his existing children. When he takes Naomi and Ruth with it, his role is not only to provide, but to continue their family name. And so, yes, that first son, Elimelech's,
Belongs.
oh yeah, for marrying Ruth, yeah. But that family line, and so that oldest born to Ruth, that land would be his, and the inheritance from that line down would be his. So meaning, this man, we're not given his name, he gains nothing. He expends resources, and on his terms, gains nothing. Never mind the fact that he would be redeeming.
Short-term, you would benefit, the long-term you would not, because
Right.
it'll pass. Yeah, eventually.
Yep.
Which shows that Boaz went above and beyond because he accepted all of that.
Absolutely.
So it's important to show that that was rejected by the first Redeemer to really show what Boaz did.
What it also gives us that we'll come back to is it shows us that redemption is optional. It's not required.
I think Boaz would have been upset if she took him, if he took her. Because every time Boaz talks about her, he's so impressed with her.
Mm-hmm.
So I think Boaz knew he had to do the right thing, but we don't know that. But I think that Boaz would have been upset if,
I agree.
because he keeps talking about, other places, they call her the Moabite woman,
Yep.
which is not really a compliment.
Yep.
But he always talks about her kindness and her generosity and taking care of her mother-in-law. I think he's impressed with her.
I agree.
First kindness you did.
Mhm.
This last kindness is greater.
Even greater.
Yeah, he knew what she'd done.
So that was Boaz's response. He goes before the elders of the people and says, "Today you are the witnesses that I have bought from Naomi all the property of Elimelech, Chilion, and Mahlon. I have also acquired Ruth the Moabite, Mahlon's widow, as my wife, in order to maintain the name of the dead with his property, so that his name will not disappear from among the family or from his hometown. Today you are my witnesses." Even in the language that Boaz uses, it's not about him and his resources as it was for the prior man. It's about his responsibility to carry on the family line for them. And yes, provide for them, redeem them, and give them a way to continue. But we see Boaz's willingness to provide resources, like you said, going above and beyond because he was not required to do so. So he's demonstrating a completely undeserved and selfless love to those in need. This is how we'll see the book of Ruth conclude. More than just a historical account of ancestry. Once Boaz affirms his redemptive rights, the elders proclaim a blessing on him. We see that in verse 12. Part of that, it says, "Through the offspring of the Lord gives you by this young woman, may your family be like that of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah." Do you remember the story of Tamar and Judah? It too was a broken story. It was a story out of Tamar prostituting herself to her father-in-law. Tamar was married to Judah's son who passed, and Judah made promises to her that he did not fulfill. And so Tamar ended up prostituting herself, becoming pregnant by Judah. The same family law that we see in place here in the book of Ruth was in place between Judah and Tamar, but where Judah fell short, Boaz is honoring the obligation. Almost like we're meant to see the contrast of those two accounts. Boaz is redeeming that account and showing what should have happened, if you will. God blesses the union between Boaz and Ruth and brings forth Obed, who became the grandfather of King David. And so the family line of the Messiah, of the great Redeemer, is carried on right here. And so we see this word triumph as we use to describe this chapter. As Ruth draws to a close, we see Ruth, a widow and a Moabite foreigner, is redeemed from a barren womb and a cut-off family line to the family line that would bring forth the Messiah. From a line of incest and brokenness to one of faithfulness and restoration. She gave up her life, but it was returned to her in abundance, and she became the great-grandmother of King David. And so we see Ruth redeemed. Naomi previously stirred the community to grief, and now in verse 14, she's going to stir the community in a different way. It says, "The women said to Naomi, 'Praise be to the Lord, who this day has not left you without a guardian redeemer. May he become famous throughout Israel.'" And it's going to go on to say that a son was brought forth, and that son was brought, Ruth's son, but the son was brought to Naomi, and fulfilled her joy that she had been previously been taken away. And so for Naomi, we see from the opening verses of death, emptiness, chaos, to life, fullness, shalom. Her bitterness is restored to sweetness. And so we see Naomi restored. And so as we wrap up here, we see the book going from the chaos of Judges to the stability of King David. From the opening verses of death to the closing verses of life upon life, as we're given the genealogy taking us from Ruth and Boaz to King David and beyond. And so we see this picture of emptiness to fullness, from tears and toil to trust and triumph, from chaos to shalom. But just as we see this powerful picture in the sovereign hand of God throughout the book of Ruth, it's ever present in our circumstances today as well. While we make our plans, God directs our steps. Proverbs is still just as relevant today. As Boaz, this man of standing is exemplified in Ruth, we also have a Redeemer. Isaiah 54 says, "For your Maker is your husband. The Lord Almighty is his name. The Holy One of Israel is your Redeemer. He is called the God of all the earth. The Lord will call you back as if you are a wife deserted and distressed in spirit, a wife who was married young only to be rejected, says your God. For a brief moment I abandoned you, but with deep compassion I will bring you back. In a surge of anger I hid my face from you for a moment, but with everlasting kindness I will have compassion on you, says the Lord your Redeemer." And so we are born into sin. We are marginalized from God the Father. We are lost members. We are strangers without a Beit Ab. Jesus came as our Redeemer, paid the price, the gall, to redeem. He was under no obligation to do so. He chose out of his hesed love and undeserved grace to pay a very steep price, his life for ours, so that we can be restored and brought back into the Beit Ab, adopted as sons and daughters of God, where we have eternal provision and protection. That is the picture that Ruth gives us. And so we are called to do the same. We are commissioned to restore the marginalized. As members of God's house, he is the patriarch, but our resources are his. And so these are the questions we leave as we wrap up here. Are we using those for his purposes? Are we helping bring shalom to other people's chaos? And are we showing them fulfillment in their emptiness? These are all questions that Ruth brings forth as we really look at the truth that it's portraying about God and about our circumstances and how we apply it today.